Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back. Very excited to have back Michele Rosenthal. Michele, welcome back. It's been a long time.
Guy, it is so good to be back. And it's been a long time, but I've been stalking you and following you and listening and watching. So a long time since we've spoken, but just one of those things like long time listener, first time caller. So,
I appreciate that.
Been hanging around you for a while.
Well, Michele is a trauma recovery specialist, award-nominated author, award-winning blogger, mental health advocate, and speaker. She's a board-certified hypnotist with a specialty in trauma and PTSD. She's a master neuro-linguistic programmer and certified professional coach. She's the author of Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices to Reclaim Your Identity, as well as Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies That Work. That was recently released with a new title, Brain is a Safe Space, How to Stop Trauma and PTSD from Controlling Your Life. Michele, welcome back.
Hey, Guy. Thanks for inviting me to just to be present with you, which is fun. So let's do it.
I appreciate that. So let's start at the beginning here. For those listeners maybe who didn't hear your first interview, give us a brief introduction. How did all this start for you?
It's such a great question. And somebody asked me that recently, and I thought, the quickest way to say this all started by accident. So I am a childhood trauma survivor, and at a time, 1981, I was 13, major severe trauma. And when I came out of the trauma, I was just a different person. I mean, it was very obvious to everyone around me, and I could feel it in myself. I was not the same person as I had been before. But in 1981, PTSD was not being applied to civilian kids who had trauma. It was being applied to Vietnam vets. So all of my PTSD symptoms, which were very evident within the first 6 months after the trauma, everybody just said, she's a difficult teenager. And, there was no way to really help me because I didn't want to be helped. So fast forward almost 30 years, and I'm struggling with PTSD all that time, undiagnosed, just thinking I was crazy. I grew up to be a temperamental artist. There was always a label and an excuse. And then when I finally, things got bad enough that I did end up starting a conventional therapeutic approach, not for trauma, but for something else. And finally got to a point where I realized I was getting worse. The more I talked, the worse I got. And I thought, okay, I have to find this isn't working. And I pulled the plug on therapy and decided to start research. And the research, I sat in the library day after day reading trauma therapy guidelines and trauma psychology books and the history of trauma psychology. And I started to piece together what I needed, what was wrong and what I needed. And hightailed myself to a trauma therapist, which before then I didn't even know existed, got my diagnosis, went on to heal. And the reason you and I are here today is that by accident, I ended up creating an enormous community of survivors who needed information about PTSD. And at the time that I did that, there weren't any other civilian PTSD sites or layman PTSD sites even. And so that audience that grew up around the world, just everything sort of exploded. The blog, the site kind of went viral for what it was in its time. And people were asking me for help. And so I decided, well, I better get trained if I'm going to really be helpful, because my mission became, and you know this, and this is where I'll end, my mission became to help others heal faster than I did. Because to lose almost 30 years of your life for something that is completely diagnosable and treatable is insane to me. And that's how you and I got here today, because that is still my mission all these years later.
Wow. So during those 30 years, had you tried to find a therapist? How did you manage?
I manage the way all survivors do, a couple of things. First of all, you develop a mask so that, you try to show the world one thing while you're something different inside. You develop a slew of coping mechanisms, none of which are very positive or healthy, and you isolate and you withdraw. And, in my case, I really thought I was crazy. I just thought I was crazy, and I am an artist. I'm a playwright. I'm a poet. So I really accepted that some people are crazy, and if I'm one of them, and you know what, creatively speaking, that's not a bad thing. So you start to tell yourself the lies that get you day to day. And I thought, well, just be as good crazy as you can be. But there was always like this little voice that would say, I don't think the problem is that you're crazy. I don't think we have to live like this. But I had no reason to listen to that voice because there was nothing in the outside world that mirrored that. And because I was terrified to talk about what had happened to me. It wasn't that nobody knew. My parents knew, my family knew. But I didn't think I could handle the emotional tidal wave that was tied to the memories. And so, no, I did not. My mother dragged me from therapist to therapist, but I would get in there and I wouldn't speak. I literally would not talk. So eventually she stopped, because the flip side of that was I would rage. I would get out of there and I would rage at my mom, So eventually she got quiet and had to just sort of stand by and watch the devastation that I brought to myself and to my family with coping mechanisms that were not good. But
what was that point when you said, all right, I need to find that trauma therapist, or I need to start doing that research?
Yeah. So I interviewed on my podcast that I had many years ago. I interviewed a researcher who told me this statistic that stuck with me forever, and it explains the moment that I got to. He said to me, "The mind is capable of producing 50% more stress than the body can actually handle." And my body, this is back in the 90s, my body got to a point where it couldn't handle the stress in my mind. So I had liver issues. I wasn't a drinker, but my liver enzymes were off the charts. I had stomach issues. I had gut issues. I had just all of these different undiagnosable, mysterious illnesses. And I was bouncing from doctor to doctor, physician to physician, specialist to specialist, looking for how to fix all the physical ailments that I had. And every doctor kept saying to me, I don't know what's wrong. I can see on your labs something's not okay, but I can't figure it out. And I was being shuffled around. And eventually I got out of this one very prominent, I spent the day at an institute I was living in New York City at the time. And I spent the day at the institute of this very prominent doctor on 52nd and Park Avenue. And when I got, and he literally sat down with me at the end of the day of these battery of tests. And he said to me, I really can't help you. And he was like the last stop. And I walked out of there dazed and confused that I could spend an entire day in an institute and then be told, I can't help you. And I stood on the corner of Park Avenue and 52nd Street, which, if anybody knows, it's near Grand Central Station and the Pan Am, not Grand Central, but near the Pan Am building and St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it was December and all of these people, it was rush hour. People were leaving work and it was cold and everybody was so happy. It was the holidays. And I just stood on that corner and cried. Because I was really, really sick. I was down to 100 pounds. I couldn't eat anything. And And like, I was going to die if somebody didn't figure out what was wrong. And it was at that moment that I called my mother from a payphone, because we still had payphones in those days. There was no cell phone. And I called my mother and I'm like, I'm going to die. Nobody's going to be able to help me. And I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed on this street corner. And my mother said to me, let's try a different way. And she gave me the name of a therapist who had founded an institute on the west side of Manhattan. And I went, not for trauma. I went to figure out how to be a chronic patient and how to manage the fear that was bringing up. But you know that the reason somebody goes to therapy is never the reason they're going to therapy. So pretty quickly we started to talk about what was beneath that, meltdown on Park Avenue.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so, you painted such a picture there, and it's intense and it's sad.
Yeah.
There's something, come on, to go through this and to think that you're crazy, right? Mm-hmm. And to navigate that and to work with that and to allow that to happen and to go on with that. How did things unfold such that you said, okay, well, let me ask you this. When did you start to feel as if, okay, this is what happened. I'm on my healing journey, finally?
Right. So for the next couple of years, I worked with this therapist, and he saved me. I was non-functional. Like, I was not able to work. I was like, things were really bad. And he was very progressive for his time. This is like 1997, 1998. And he was doing emotional freedom technique and EMDR and thought field therapy and tapas acupressure. So we were talking things through, but we were also energetically using all of these energy modalities. Wow. And so that got me functional. I got back to work within like maybe 6 or 9 months. And so that was good. And I got stronger and stronger and stronger. And I did, what most of us do, which is you think you're getting better and then you don't need therapy anymore because you're on your way. Right. So, and because you get to that point where you don't want to go to the deepest, most painful part, you want to stay like in that place where I'm up here, I'm managing, I'm getting better, everything's amazing. I just needed this little reset. And you tell yourself the lie that you need to like avoid the deeper work. And so I did that. And then I took a break from therapy, and then I went back because my body was still breaking down. And the next thing I knew, I was 35 years old and diagnosed with advanced osteoporosis. And this endocrinologist on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, like my whole journey was all over Manhattan. And he said to me, he said, your bones are going to start to spontaneously crumble in 10 years or less. Mm-hmm. You need to figure out what's going on with your head, because this is not just a problem in your body. And he was the first doctor to say to me, there's a connection here. Mm-hmm. Like, you need to figure out what's going on. And he didn't know, which I think people know now. You have to ask somebody, do you have trauma in your history? Because bodies don't, it's like Bessel's book. The body keeps the score. Like, we know that now. But back then, nobody was talking about it. So all he could say to me is, what's going on in your head is affecting your body, and you've got to figure that out. Well, the idea of my bones spontaneously crumbling terrified and triggered me. And I hightailed it back to therapy twice a week. And I accelerated the process until I crashed, because talk therapy has its place. But if you just keep talking and talking and talking about your trauma, we know this now, activating those neural networks, strengthening those neural pathways. They work faster and more efficiently. So you're really just activating your sympathetic nervous system even more. And I didn't know any of the science back then, but to answer your question, I knew I was getting worse and not better. Oh, wow. And it was that really started to scare me. Like, if you can be in therapy and you're getting worse, what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was when I decided I had to start researching my trauma. I needed to understand trauma psychology. I needed to understand physically what had happened to me, emotionally, mentally, what had gone on and the side effects of it, like the fallout of trauma. And that was what ultimately got me on the healing path, that I decided this is the answer to your question, Guy. And it just dropped in. For a long time, I thought somebody else was responsible for my recovery. Like, I got into therapy and I wanted my therapist to fix it. Like, I did my part. I showed up.
Mm-hmm.
I did my part. I was willing to talk, but it was his job to fix it. And what changed was that I realized I had to fix it. I had to take on the responsibility of that internal process, that internal shift. And it was not my therapist's job to do that. I'm not even sure it was his job to lead me to that. It was just his job to give me a space that it was safe for me to discover and explore what that process would be. And when I figured that out, that was a game changer, that I was really responsible. Because up until that moment, I didn't realize that that was part of what was going wrong, was that I hadn't figured out how to engage on my own behalf and pull up that stronger self inside of me that I needed to embody to get the job done. Because I was very much in my survivor victim self.
Wow. Huge insight.
Right? Big shift.
We're speaking with Michele Rosenthal. I just want to pause a moment here to thank our sponsors. You have so many great insights. I mean, talking to you is really interesting, Michele, because as you're sharing your story, you're dropping these like wisdom gold nuggets here. Really, at what point did you say, okay, you know what? I want to start sharing this. I want to start building this community where infusing people with this empowerment. How did that happen for you?
I never had that thought, Guy. I never had that thought. So it's a funny story. By the time I finished my recovery, and I went into, when I realized I'm responsible, I have to do this, I made a pact with myself. I was going all the way. Recovery for me, and this is just me because it's not everybody, and I respect everybody has their own definition of recovery. My definition was every single symptom has to be eliminated. That means an end to insomnia, an end to nightmares, an end to flashbacks, an end to depression. I wanted 100% total freedom, and I was going until I got there. So when I finally achieved that, I was 40. I had no family, no career, no relationship, like none of the things that a 40-year-old was supposed to have. And suddenly the world was like in Technicolor when I was used to black and white. So it was very like jarring and discombobulating to be healed, but suddenly not have an identity that was commensurate with like who I was supposed to be at that age. And so I was working for my brother at the time because I just didn't know what to do with myself. And it was a family business. So it was like I could make my own hours. You know, if I didn't want to go in one day, it's my baby brother. I could just not go in that day. But I happened to be in the office one day and saying to him, I don't know what to do with myself. I don't even know who I am. Like, I don't have a post-trauma identity. And I don't know who I'm supposed to be. And he said to me, you know, before your trauma, you were a writer. You've been a writer since you were 7. That's part of you, who you've always been. And he said, you know, why don't you write about what you just experienced, like what it means to have PTSD and how to heal. And he said, but don't do it in a journal. You've got stacks and stacks of those. There's this new thing now. It's called a blog. Do it on the internet. I'm like, a blog? on the internet. I didn't even know what that was. It was like at the very beginning, there was no, it was Blogspot. If you remember Blogspot,
I do.
like back in the day, right? So he said to do that. And I thought, oh, okay. But I thought my trauma is so bizarre and rare, and it's so graphic. I don't like to describe it because it's uncomfortable for people. So I was like, people aren't really going to understand what I'm talking about, because my trauma is it's not like a big niche, if you will. But I thought, okay, I'll start blogging. And so there was no intention. I didn't think I want to help all these people. I just thought, well, let me just do what my brother said, because I need to find myself. And it's a funny thing when you just get back to the basics of who you are. What happens when you just put yourself out there and say, this is me. This was my experience. And within 3 weeks, veterans started emailing me saying, they would read the blog and they would email me, or they would leave a comment and say, how do you know exactly how I feel? And I would write back to them, I don't. I'm just writing how I feel. And then rape survivors were writing saying, you just put into words what I've been trying to express for 15 years. How did you do that? I don't know. I'm just saying how I feel.
Wow.
And it started this whole conversation, and the community just started to grow and grow, because all these like-minded people started, people shared the blog, and so it happened by accident. It was never intentional. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. It was just one trauma survivor sharing her experience, and it spoke to people, and we all came together to connect. And that's partly what made it so magical.
I mean, the way you're talking about it and describing it, it does sound beautiful. There's just something so authentic about it. And you're bearing your soul and sharing who you are without any thought of, oh, I'm going to go viral and I'm going to create this really popular blog. And
I really thought no one was ever going to read it.
So let's jump forward now. What are you doing now? How are you kind of working to help people?
So now there are a couple of things that I really love. Number one, having conversations with people like you, so that we collectively share the knowledge. Because one of the things I think is really missing is that sense of community. In fact, the client that I'm working with, when we're finished, one of the main thing that she expressed when we first started working together is she's so lonely. She doesn't know anyone who's had PTSD or who's in recovery. And I think that's a huge element. Like PTSD symptoms, trauma symptoms isolate us anyway, partly because of how we cope and also because we hide. And so I think that connection, when we have conversations like this, and how we can create community around the subject, that's one thing that I'm doing that I really value. The other thing is I love to speak. So speaking at conferences and things like that, same thing, is sharing the words, spreading the ideas, so that we help to elevate the process of healing so that more people can access it, and writing books. And so that's the public stuff. Now the private stuff is what I do, here in my office with clients, where we're one-on-one slogging through the muck together and rising up to a different place.
You've shared your experience and your story about, through years where you just didn't know what the hell was going on. When you work with people, when you speak, what do you want to communicate? How do you want to, what do you feel that you're bringing to the table in your voice, from your experience?
What a neat question. So the first thing is hope. Hope. Like that's, if I could only have one outcome from my work. Of course, I want everyone to feel better, but that comes after hope. To me, you can't achieve anything unless you hope you can achieve something. So That's the first thing, because I think we get so depressed and despondent and full of despair, and there's no, it's not like penicillin. Like, if we all had bronchitis, you take penicillin and in 3 days you're going to feel better. But with PTSD, it's so unique. The healing process is so individual. We're all snowflakes. So the only thing we share is the hope from which we begin that process. And if you access hope, then it can really get you through those difficult moments. So I think that's the first thing, Guy, really is hope. And oddly enough, when I first started, there were some clinicians that really hated me. I mean, the vitriol, the trolls, the threatening emails that I got that I was a fraud and they were going to report me and all this
When
stuff.
you started the blog, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah, when the blog got really popular, so that like, I wish somebody told me much later, and I wish I had known this from the beginning, that when people start to hate you, you'll know you're really doing some good. But at the time, there was this one psychiatrist from Harvard who would not leave me alone, telling me that I was a fake and a fraud, and that I was damaging all these people. And I, for a while, like, you try to take the high road. And then I finally wrote back and I said, what are you talking about? Like, what is so fraudulent about what I'm doing? Because if I'm doing something fraudulent, I want to stop. But I've like checked, and as far as I know, everything I'm doing is really okay. And you know what she wrote back to me? She said, "You're a fraud. You're giving people hope." And I thought, well, if that's fraudulent, then I'll do it all day long, because how is anybody going to heal if they don't have the hope that they can do it? Like, you have to hope in something. And if you don't hope in yourself, borrow hope from somebody else. So I think that's, like, we all have to start with that tiny little feeling of, I hope I can get this done. And that's the number one thing that I want my work to express, is that if you find anything in my work or what I say or my books or my whatever that gives you the tiniest bit of hope that you can achieve what I've achieved or what all these other people have achieved in their recovery, then I've done my job. And I get super passionate about that. So I'll pause there. But I think it's so important to break through to that place of hope.
I totally agree. And was that hope, did you have that hope during those 10 years, whatever?
Not in the beginning. In the beginning, when I was saying to myself, look, you're crazy. Some people are supposed to be crazy. This is good for creativity. Just go be good crazy. I didn't hope that I could heal. It never occurred. I didn't know there was anything to heal from. Once I started to do all this research, so I researched what happened to me, which led me to trauma research, which led me to trauma psychology research, which led me to dissociation, which led me to PTSD, which led me to a PTSD self-test. That was interesting. There were 22 questions, and I answered positively to 20 of them. And I took that to my therapist at the time, who was not a trauma therapist. And I said to him, do you think this means I have PTSD? And he said to me, what is PTSD? And I thought, oh my God, no wonder I'm getting worse. I'm in the wrong place.
Oh boy.
Like, this man is wonderful and he's lovely, but he's not equipped to help me. But that gave me hope, because that self-test started to let me know I'm not crazy. Like, something happened to me that has caused a change in me that could be changed again. Like, we're organisms built for change. So that gave me hope. And that hope is what I lived on from, like, that was like, I don't know, like 2005. And that hope got me through the next 2 years of my recovery and out the other side. So, and I think I got it done quickly because I hoped so fervently that it could be done. So, So I think it's, what are you thinking in asking that question?
Well, I just think that you are sharing so courageously your story, your openness. And I think I was struck by, you said for 10 years you were going on and not knowing what was going on. I mean, that's a hell of a long time to be wearing a mask and to be trying to come up with the good crazy. That's an incredibly long time. And I think I'm just really struck, Michele, by your openness and your authenticity, and it really comes across, and it's very powerful. You're a very powerful presence and speaker. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I really feel like, we spend so much time hiding because of our self-judgments, right? It's because of how we judge ourselves that we hide. Before anyone else has a chance to judge us, it's that we agree with their judgment that is the problem, or that we judge ourselves because we don't let anybody else see the truth. So I really feel like the process itself evolves as quickly as we evolve inside our own mind in terms of how we perceive who we are truly and authentically. So in order to really heal, you have to take the mask off. You just really do. You have to stand in all the ugliness, the glorious ugliness of who trauma has turned you into. And to me, that's the starting point of being able to know what you want to achieve. Because if you can't stand authentically and say, I literally, while I was still in therapy, like the first round of therapy, no, after the whole, like your bones are going to crumble, when I went back into therapy, I was so full of fear. And I realized that part of the problem was that I just didn't have a good grip on my own self. And I didn't know, I'd been researching identity, oddly enough, since I was 19. Just the topic of identity had just really captivated me. And not because I understood why, I just found it interesting. And of course, all those years later, I realized, it's because I didn't have the right identity. I didn't have a grip on my identity. But what I found really intriguing is that when you're that terrified, it forces you to look at who you are if you're willing. It's an invitation to look at who you really are. And I sat down one day and I decided to write all the things I hated about myself, because I didn't have a picture of like what it meant to heal. Like I just knew I didn't want to be this, but I didn't know what was that. So I sat down and I was like, all right, I'm just going to write out all the things I hate about myself. It took 5 legal pages, like those long yellow legal pad. And I folded each page, and I have my clients do this now. I folded each page lengthwise. So there was a column A on the left and a column B on the right. And on the left column, I wrote everything I hated about myself. 5 pages of everything I hated about myself, from the way I looked to the way I behaved, to the way I thought, to the way I felt, all of that. And then in column B, I literally wrote the opposite of each item. And then I folded it so I could just see column B, like the opposite of who I was. And this helped me start to create and deepen my hope, right? Because now I'm looking at, okay, if I could choose to be somebody else, if I could start to build a new identity, it would be the opposite of who I am. And now on column B, when that's all I have to look at, I have some concrete ideas for what that means. And just that gave me hope that I could start to see ahead. And it's a simple exercise anyone can do. But when you do it, you stand more authentically in who you are, because you've had the willingness to look and say, this is me. Wow. That's powerful.
Michele Rosenthal, what is the best way for people to get in contact with you?
mytraumacoach.com. Okay. Very easy. mytraumacoach.com. And you'll see on the header of the site, if it's useful, I'm really big on the neurology of healing. So there's a train your brain audio that literally trains your brain for peace and calm. It's less than 20 minutes. We all like the new research is it takes 66 days for the trauma brain to create a new habit. So I recommend to everybody do this for 66 days. And then, just delight and see what happens. A lot of the feedback I get is people fall asleep while they listen to it, which is perfectly fine. But they start to feel calmer. They sleep better. They feel just a little more grounded in who they are. So you can just do the smallest thing and it starts to create a shift that can give you hope for being able to do the bigger things. So thanks for this time, Guy. It's been really nice to be with you.
I mean, you are just really amazing. You have so many insights, I think, that are really unique and powerful. So great to talk to you. Love to have you back. And hopefully it'll be less time than years.
I'll really quickly write a new book.
All right. Good talking to you.
To connect. But thank you so much, Guy. I have such admiration for what you do, and partly to close this out because of how authentically you do it. It's always been one of the things that I really so appreciate about you. So thank you for being you.
Oh, you're welcome. I appreciate it. It's great having you back.